It would be worth your time to go get one. I mean, right here for class. The thesis is then that there was a specific office of the prophet in Israel, and in saying that, we acknowledge that the usage of the biblical terms is broader than just as a designation of the office. The words, the noun, and the verbs that are relevant here are used for something broader than that. And a couple of obvious examples I usually start with. One is in Luke 11, verses 50 and 51, where the Lord says that the blood of all the prophets, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, that's the reference there. And comparison with the passage in Matthew 23, verse 35, speaks not of the blood of all the prophets, but of all of the righteous blood. So comparing the two, the righteous explains the meaning of prophets in Luke 11 being something for the godly in general, rather than just someone with a particular office in their midst. And another rather general one is in Hebrews, the opening verse of the epistle to the Hebrews, where the word prophets is used to cover virtually the whole pre-Messianic revelation. In many various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets. Now, of course, in His Son, but the pre-Messianic revelation is designated by the term prophet. So we acknowledge that the word is used for more than just the office. And a couple of illustrations of a more individual, specific type, where people who are not occupants of the office are nevertheless called prophets. One such is David. And of course, David is a king, not a prophet. And yet in Acts 2, verse 30, Peter, then dealing with Psalm 16, says of David, the king, that David, being a prophet, foresaw and spoke of the resurrection of Christ. So clearly the term is used for those whom we might say had the prophetic gift, and yet didn't have the prophetic office, such as David. Now another one that might strike you as not being an exception to the official usage is Daniel. And yet, as it turns out, Daniel is not one who held the office of the prophet, but he did, of course, have the gift of prophecy. And we'll be talking about the arrangement of the Hebrew canon in a moment. And as you know, in that threefold arrangement of the canon, the book of Daniel is not found in the section where the other official prophets are. Daniel then was not in that office sense a prophet. He was clearly a statesman, a wise man there in the court of the heathen king. In the days of Daniel, Israel in exile, the one who functioned as the official prophet, the one to whom the elders of Israel came and gathered for God's word to the covenant congregation, was Ezekiel, rather than Daniel. So Daniel did not occupy the prophet, and yet just as David is called a prophet, and our Lord himself is the one who refers to Daniel. In Matthew, we're thinking of Matthew 24, verse 15, where Jesus refers to the passage as that which was spoken of, and that which was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, referring to that business of the abomination of desolation, is that which was spoken of by the prophet Daniel. So this we acknowledge that there is a broader usage of the terms prophet and prophesy, but now in spite of that we are insisting that there is evidence to establish the thesis that there was a particular office. Now the point that I wish to make here, I discussed in the Structure of Biblical Authority, around pages 57 and 8, and this general context we'll be having occasion to look back at here again. It's in the chapter I call the Covenantal Bible, where I'm trying to show that the various sections of the Old Testament canon, and the New Testament for that matter, can be seen as variations on one or another category within the general treaty covenant form. And so I come to the section then in prophecy and say the question of the covenantal nature of the latter prophets may be approached. Now, by the way, the latter prophets, we're dealing with the language of former and latter prophets to distinguish two parts of the second section of the Hebrew canon, the former prophets being Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, things that you would think of as historical in their nature. And then the latter prophets being the ones that you normally think of as prophets, the major ones and the minor ones, except for Daniel, as we said, who is in a different section. So the question of the covenantal nature now of the latter prophets, the major ones, the minor ones, may be approached through the office of their authors. Those who fulfilled the prophetic office were Yahweh's messengers, not only in the general sense that they were inspired agents of revelation, though they were, along with others, they were of course that, but in the particular sense that they performed a distinctive diplomatic function. So here's a group of people with a very specific covenantal function. The label prophet was employed in a more general sense, as we have just acknowledged, and I use some of the same illustrations we just used, the entire Old Testament revelation, Hebrews 1:1, and so forth. It is, however, methodologically unsound to appeal to this broader, this charismatic usage, the idea of prophecy as a gift. It's unsound to appeal to that, to obscure the difference between the revelatory gift and the administrative office. There are two separate things. They must be kept distinct. And in obscuring that, one ends up denying the existence of the prophetic office, and that footnotes referring to scholarly articles that have done that very thing and denied the existence of the office. Adequate procedure requires that the word study be conjoined with sociological analysis, and such an analysis plainly discloses the presence of a specific prophetic function and office in Israel. The prophets were the representatives of Yahweh in the administration of his covenant over Israel, to declare his claims and to enforce his will through effective proclamation. And then I go on to give as evidence the establishment of the prophetic office was itself a matter of treaty stipulation. Moses, prophet mediator of the Old Covenant, arranged in the Deuteronomic treaty for his covenantal task to be furthered by a succession of prophets like unto himself. And then, of course, that's Deuteronomy 18, to which we will be turning presently for a closer look at that. So that right in the midst of the Deuteronomic treaty, there is a section that is dealing with the various officers, and among them they deal, in Deuteronomy 18, with this office of the prophet, saying much as to the prerequisites and as to the functions, both the forming and the function of the prophet. Now, just before turning to that line of evidence, which is the most decisive, the actual exegetical evidence that demands we recognize an office, there is this other thing that we have been alluding to, which is the matter of the arrangement of the books in the Hebrew canon. And our point there will be that so firmly had this reality of the office of the prophet implanted itself on the people of God, that in arranging the books of the canon, the recognition of the prophetic office was a key determinant. Now then, we have to do then with that arrangement of the books in the Hebrew canon, and this involves both the number of the divisions and the total number of the books, and the various evidence that we have for this confronts us with the fact that that there were either 22 or 24 books in the canon according to their counting, and so our 36 become 22 or 24 when you do things, for example, like count the 12 so-called minor prophets as one, or 1st and 2nd Samuel as one. So there's a variety of ways in which what we count individually are counted together, which ends up with either 22 or 24 as the total. And evidently the difference between those two summaries would have to do with the books of Ruth and of Lamentation. If you include the book of Ruth with the book of Judges, which is one of the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, then that reduces the 24 to 23. And if you then also reckon Lamentations with the Jeremiah, and therefore count Lamentations as part of the latter prophets, and that would further reduce the 24 to 22. So there are those two. But in any case, you have those totals, 22 and 24. But also then you have the division of the books in the Old Testament canon. And here there's a lot of technical and somewhat debated material as to how far back these divisions go. But we have the threefold division that's in our Bibles here today. The Torah and the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the law and the prophets and the writings. And it's a question then of how far back that particular threefold division go. But then there are other analyses of the material that divide them into often into two sections, like the law and the prophets, or into three. Now, one book that has studied this at length was written by Roger Beckwith, and the title of it was The Old Testament Canon of the New Testament Church, the Old Testament Canon of the New Testament Church, and its background in early Judaism. The Old Testament Canon of the New Testament Church and its background in early Judaism, where he takes the position that those totals, 22 and 24, and also even the threefold division that we're familiar with, go back to the 2nd century BC. Now, some others dispute that you can really demonstrate that it goes back to that far. But it is they're very early on, and could well be Beckwith is right in this, and so that this arrangement is one that's on the scene. And the question then becomes what accounts for this threefold division. Why then the 5 books of Moses constituting the Torah? What is it that is decisive for placing a book in this second section of the canon, and as over against its being in the third? Now, this whole subject of the threefold canon, we to deal with it thoroughly, you'd have to deal with the modern views of the matter, which would say that there is not a logical explanation for the particular division that we have, but it's rather a chronological thing we're dealing with. the modern critical notion of the canon then is that, of course, it is not the Lord who determines the authority and the canonicity of the material, but that it is some human counsel. It's a human decision that imparts canonicity to the books, and specifically as they see it, the time came when the five books that were, whether rightly or wrongly attributed to Moses, were canonized. And so there is a chronological development where in the days after the exile, the thought was that the Israelites finally got around to setting aside to have this authoritative status over covenant community of the work which was by Moses, or at least attributed to him. And so that accounts for what's in the first section. Now, at that time, then, the other works, whether some of them were actually written or not, and this would all depend again on critical late dating of material and so on, but whether they existed or not, the books that subsequently are found in the prophets and then the Ketuvim, the writings, were not yet canonized, and so then they try to reconstruct the factors in the ongoing history which would have led the Jewish community to finally set aside a second block of material as canonical, and so the fact that it is there, it reflects this history of canonization. I hate that term, canonization, but the history of the canonization of this material. Now here are the Psalms and Daniel and all these other things that are in the writings. They were on the scene there in whatever the 3rd century was, at the 2nd century BC, when this second section of the canon was supposed to have been canonized, but they hadn't attained to this authority yet. But then time goes on, and other factors begin to feed into the situation, and at last the Jewish community sets aside a whole third block of material that by then is current as a third part of their canon. And this, of course, can go right down into the 1st century AD still, and with some opinion that even at that point it wasn't altogether closed. But on this critical approach to the thing then, you don't have to find a logical reason for this threefold division. It allegedly reflects a history, a three-stage history of canonization. So in dealing with that broad subject, we of course would want to attack it in terms of the whole theological concept of canon, and you can see the part of it is the thought that the canonization is a very sophisticated and late dawning notion in the life of people, and that's why they don't even begin the canonization of the Old Testament until the exilic period with the canonization of the Pentateuch. And so there's all of that. In terms of my own writings, I was especially then concerned to attack that notion that canonization is a late phenomenon in the world of that time, and so in the structure of biblical authority, a major thesis I'm trying to develop is that what is involved in the idea of canonical writings is already formally present in the reality of covenants. And you remember our discussion of this perhaps in the Pentateuch class then, where we said that what you have in these ancient covenants, which were there long before the exile, which were there on the scene back in the days of Moses, and earlier still, what you have is precisely that of authoritative, inviolate, inscripturated documents. And particularly the fourth of the 6 sections in the treaty, the document clause, included the canonical curse even, that so sacred, so authoritative and not to be tampered with was this treaty document that anyone who did thus add to, subtract from, or change anything in these authoritative texts would be subject to all of the curses of the covenant, which would then be listed in a subsequent section of the treaty. So here, you have in a formal sense. Now, obviously, there's the distinct element of divine inspiration, which is present in the biblical authoritative documents. But just as a formal idea, the idea of authoritative texts that were regarded as subject to divine sanctions and not to be tampered with, that idea is ancient in Israel. So the idea of canon is present in covenant, and covenant is present from Moses' days on. Therefore, canon, the formal idea, is present. And so I would say that the whole modern critical mentality and approach to the thing is undercut by the objective realities of the evidence. But nevertheless, that's all part of the way in which they reconstruct it. And so they say that the threefold division reflects a three-stage canonization, all of which is much later than what we would regard as the art. In our view, the books are canonical on production, on appearance, because they are already divinely authoritative, and no one can add that to them afterwards or take it away from them then. So there's the whole theology of the thing. But now we are still then left, if it's not to be explained in terms of this chronological development, what was the logical explanation when they sat down and they're organizing these books, which they have recognized as canonical throughout their history, and now what logically explains it? And to come right to the bottom line, what it is not altogether or primarily perhaps the content as the authorship. Now, if you just look at content, why is Kings in the second section and Chronicles in the third? And questions of this type. So long since in conservative circles, way back, someone like William Henry Green was writing on this subject and took this position, and I think it's a fundamentally sound position still. That the key factor there is that of authorship, and so the 5 books of Moses, unique, stands alone. Hebrews 3, Moses over God's Old Testament house, Jesus over God's New Testament house, Moses alone in that particular status. Yes, we'll see the prophets carry on the administration of the covenant. They're like unto Moses, but he is there as the original mediator at the inauguration of that Mosaic covenant, and therefore his writings stand by themselves there at the beginning. And now the next section, which as we have mentioned, is divided into the former and the latter prophets. The former, historical type stuff, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. The latter, what we would think of as prophetic. And at this point, former and latter is not a chronological distinction. It doesn't mean that the ones that are classified as former prophets were written before the others. That's not it. It's just that in the arrangement of the canon, they come first and the others come second. So it's not a matter of chronology here. But what is it? Why are these books, former and latter prophets, together as over against the miscellaneous collection of things, psalms, lamentation, love songs, history, and so on, that you get in the writings in the third section? And this is the point that it had to do with the office. There was a distinct office of the prophet, and whether the prophet wrote a book of history, like Joshua, Judges, or Samuel, or Kings, or whether he wrote what you would recognize as a prophecy like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on. If a prophet, someone who had the office of the prophet, wrote it, then these books were gathered together. And here's the book of Chronicles. The author of the book of Chronicles was not a prophet, and that's why Chronicles is not where Kings is in the second section. So now that is the explanation that has been given, and in support of it, by the way, especially in support of the notion of the official prophets writing books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, is that there's a whole series of references within the biblical histories, Chronicles and so on, telling you that, look, here's the history of so-and-so the king. If you want to know a little bit more about this particular king, consult the annals written by so-and-so the prophet or so-and-so the seer. So we actually have a whole line of evidence telling us that that was one of the functions of a prophet, to be engaged in producing the records of the covenant community. And in fact, now that will become an important feature when we are analyzing the role of the prophets later on, and especially when we're showing how they were God's lawyers and conducting God's lawsuit against Israel when they were breaking the Mosaic covenant. One of the points we'll be making is that they had produced throughout the history of Israel, generation after generation, the official record of God's faithfulness and Israel's covenant breaking, which is what the thing is all about. And so that when the day comes for them to take their place in court, they already have the official written records. So the idea that the prophets were involved in writing such books fits in with the whole biblical picture in an illuminating way. But now that then is the explanation of why we have what we do have in the second section, and why others. It's not a question of degrees of inspiration or anything like that, but it's simply that the authors, and some of them clearly had the gift of prophecy. We've already noticed the Psalms, including David. He had the gift of prophecy. Daniel is included in the third section. He had the gift of prophecy, but he didn't have the office. And so this is what would account for that. Now, that I think is a proper explanation of the thing. If we spend more time on this, we could think of some minor exception which is readily understandable. For example, the 5 books of Moses represent his writings. What about Psalm 90? All right. So Psalm 90 is attributed to Moses. And how come Psalm 90 isn't in the first part? Well, you can quibble like that, but obviously here you don't take one psalm out of the whole Psalter then. So there would be other considerations that might slightly affect one book or one passage like this here or there. But fundamentally, the explanation that is the author that accounts for the analysis is on the right track. Now then, all this adds up to then is that, look, so pronounced, so clear was it in the sensitivities of the mind, the understanding of the covenant community, that there was a distinct office of the prophet when it came to this basic task this important task of organizing the books of the canon. They let that factor control the arrangement of things. All right, so that's one line of evidence. Now, however, as I said, a more decisive line of evidence is the exegetical one that we have when we turn to Deuteronomy 18. So let's do that now. And so I do hope that there are Hebrew Bibles in sight so everyone can cast his or her eyes upon the Hebrew text here. And how many of you cannot see a Hebrew text from where you are sitting? Okay. Well, you all have them on your computers? Good. All right. I don't know if they're heavier or lighter than a Hebrew Bible.
They're about the same.
They're lighter?
They're about the same.
About the same. No, okay.
It's a lot easier to find them.
Deuteronomy, then. All right. Which you all know is, in its overall form, a treaty. Starting with identification of the Lord as the speaker through his authoritative servant Moses. Moving on then in chapters 4 and following to the historical prologue material, rehearsing the good things that the Lord had done for the Israelites during the ministry of Moses. And then moving on to the central section, which was the commandments, the legislative requirements that were set forth, and then the book closing out with arrangements for the dynastic succession, for the ongoing covenant, and for the various witnesses and so on, that reflected the closing section of the treaty pattern. But now our particular interest is in that central core of the covenant stipulations, the commandments. And within that section, then, Deuteronomy 18, starting with around chapter 16 and then 17 and then including 18, the legislation is not just about individual morality or cultic ceremonial details, but it has to do with the organization of the governance of the community through a series of officers, officials. And it starts then in chapter 16, verses 18 and following, by dealing with the office of the judge. Now here we have to do, as well as with the office of the king subsequently in chapter 17, we have to do with what we might call prophetic legislation, because it involves a foresight of what the future circumstances would be. And so before they have crossed into the Jordan, before they've settled in the land, before there has been yet the need for those judges, the Lord is anticipating that and legislatively is prescribing for that when it should happen. And so in chapter 16, verses 18 and following, he deals with the office of the judge. And then you move into chapter 17, and in that chapter there's some dealing with priests, but also especially with the king, the office of the king. And again, prophetic legislation. And in of course, the critical mentality once again is that here is a reason why the book of Deuteronomy couldn't be back in the days of Moses, because it's legislating about kings and they don't have kings until much later and so on. All right, no, there is prophetic legislation. The Lord knows in due course there will be a king, and he provides norms and standards for that when it should happen, and so that's what we have in chapter 17. The beginning of chapter 18 is dealing once again with Levitical priests, so judges, priests, kings, and now in the middle of Deuteronomy he comes to this further figure of the Navi, the prophet figure, which then, like these others, is clearly intended as a covenantal office. And so we look now at the text. And we'll be seeing what is said about this provision of a Navi, a prophet. Deuteronomy 18. And in your reading assignment, I guess I asked you to begin at
15.
which verse?
15.
15?
Yes.
Okay, all right. We'll start our reading today at verse 9, get the little background. So as we read along then in these verses, we'll be finding then that God institutes what is clearly the office of the prophet in Israel. Now, I won't ask students to recite or to read Hebrew in any of these places. I've said that you should be prepared before we come to the particular section, be familiar with the text, but in class we try to keep things at a happier level and to ask you to recite, on Hebrew. The only thing I might do from time to time is I might come to some forum and just to try to get a feel for where the class is in terms of its expertise in Hebrew. Might ask for a course as to what this particular form is, and I'm usually greeted with a solo rather than a chorus, and the soloist often turns out to be the same one, which tells me what I'm looking for too, I guess. But let's look here at Deuteronomy now. 18, verse 9. Ki ata ba el haaretz asher Yahweh, and so forth. Now then, when
Can we do that?
eyes on the inspired text here. When you now are coming, ata ba. So you can tell from the verb it doesn't have a particular second person affirmative to go with ata, so it's not a perfect tense or something. It's the participle clearly. Huh? So you are now coming. You are about to enter into the land which Yahweh Eloheka Nothein Lak, which the Lord your God is giving you. So it's of course the dramatic episode of the last day of Moses' life. He's about to ascend the mountain of God to die, and he's setting the house of God in order beforehand. So that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about. In particular, there's the matter of dynastic succession, that Joshua is the Lord's appointee to be that successor of Moses, and so the whole arrangement there in plains of Moab is to bring forth from Israel a renewed oath of allegiance, and specifically that they will accept Joshua as the follower of Moses. So there they are, about to enter the land which the Lord, Nothein, another participle, is giving to them. And now when you do, right away, now negatively, we get the why God's provision of the Navi was so necessary. It is because of what they would encounter within the land of Canaan, the abominations that were found there, which they must not emulate. So when you enter there, do not learn la'asot, to do, another infinitive, an infinitive construct, la'asot from asa, to do according to the abominations of those nations. So that's where he starts out. This is the problem that you're going to face. And you must not, in your interest and your concern to know the divine will, copy the techniques of the Canaanites. Now, this is spelled out a little bit then in terms of a whole variety of techniques that were used in the ancient world. They're attested in other extra-biblical documents as well. And verse 10 starts out, however, with something that the immediate connection with prophecy or oracular disclosures is not all that evident. It's the matter of the immolation of children to the god Molech, and the consuming of them in the fire. Molech, the Nergal, the god of the underworld, whose cult is in the valley of Hinnom at Tophet, apparently meaning something like stove or oven. But here is that horrible practice then of the immolation of children to the god Molech, and starts with that warning. Let there not be found. Yimad say. Okay, there's one. What stem is that, course? From the verb matzah. There, good, wonderful. This expert class. All right, Nifal, very good. So let there not be found among you now. Now, ma'avir. Here's another one. All right, it's from the verb avir. It's a participle. What stem is this one? Okay, pathic under the reformative, and hirik yod as the thematic vowel, hifil. So let there not be found among you anyone who avir, pass over, ma'avir, to cause to pass over. So anyone who causes beno bito, his son or his daughter, to pass ba'esh through the fire. So whether in fact this terrible cultic practice was somehow associated with the securing of oracles as well, it stands here at the beginning of the abominations that they are to be avoiding, but then it moves on to more obviously oracular type matters when it says koseim kisamim, which has to do then with the practicing of divination. You have the verb and you have the cognate noun. Anyone who divines divinations. And then there's another term, onain, which has to do with soothsaying, again determining the future. And uminach, which is the consulting of omens. And then the next term, the last term in this series of participles in verse 10, and this last one is another PL form, the doubling of the middle radical, of course, the key sign here of the intensive stem, and it has to do with witchcraft, a type of a thing practicing witchcraft. And that thought is continued in the 11th verse in the thought of someone casting a spell, again with a verb and the cognate noun, hover and haver. No one then casting spells or binding spells on people. And then it closes with a whole series of things having to do with necromancy, with the consulting of the dead and so on. And so after the binding of spells, then you have shoel, a participle, anyone consulting unto ov, a ghost or a spirit, perhaps originally going back to a word that referred to a hole in the ground from which the spirit muttered or spoke. But there was someone consulting then unto a ghost or a familiar spirit, or it could refer to the spiritist person rather than the spirit that was consulted. Or then sort of summarizing at the end, it says, Doresh el ha-metim, anyone then that would be consulting unto the dead from the realms of the dead to be getting their oracles. Don't do any of these things. These are all an abomination. As verse 12 goes on then to say, for an abomination of the Lord, call ose ela, anyone, everyone who does these things. And as a matter of fact, Biglal, it is precisely because of these abominations, hatoivot ha'ela, precisely because of these abominations, that Yahweh your God, morish otam mipaneka, morish otam mipaneka, another hiphil participle, this one from the peyod verb yarash, to take possession of, to dispossess. And of course that's a common verb describing what God does by way of driving out the Canaanites and making way for the Israelites, or also used for what the Israelites themselves do in their holy war. They are dispossessing, and here the action is referred to the Lord himself. It's precisely now because of these abominations that the Lord your God is dispossessing them from before you. You are going to get the land as a gift, that they are replaced, and so of course the warning is in place. Don't repeat their sad story, or the same thing will happen to you. And the worst tragedy of all is that they do repeat the practice of the Canaanites, and they are driven out of the land just as the Canaanites were driven out of the land. And that is why one of the two last words that we come to in studying the future as it's seen through the eyes of the prophets is the word fall. Israel did not listen to this early on warning of what would happen to them, and so they are dispossessed from the land. And in terms of that old covenant, they have no place in the land. Any hope they have as individuals is in terms of the promised covenant to Abraham, which is realized in the new covenant, which of course was underlying the whole Old Testament regime. But nevertheless, there was the phenomenon of the superadded on Mosaic covenant of works, in terms of which they fell, in terms of which they committed these abominations, and they too had to be driven out of the land. And so then verse 13 comes out positively. Don't learn to do these abominations, but rather tamim tehya. Now here we get that concept of perfect, we think of someone like Job, whom the Lord was able to point to in the face of Satan's maligning of Job, and to say that Job was perfect and and what's going on here theologically. Are there these perfect, sinless people around? No, that's not the force of the Tom. As I suggest that these terms for perfection in terms of covenant life have to do with genuineness as over against phoniness. Not that the people of God in making their commitment to the Lord are already any more than we are today perfectly sinless, but we can be true and genuine, or we can be hypocrites. And so what is being demanded here now is that you be genuine and vigorous in carrying out the demands of the covenant. So perfect shall you be with Yahweh your God. So there's the general picture that leads up now in verse 14. Well, not quite yet, I guess. In verse 15, we will come to the word Navi. In verse 14, there's a little further explanation. For these nations, which you are driving them out, and now what had been attributed to the Lord dispossessing them is now attributed to the activity of the Israelites themselves as God's holy army. So these nations which you are driving them out, they unto the soothsayers and unto the diviners Yishma'u. All right, so there you have the pausal form with the Athenic accent instead of Yishma'u, Yishma'u from the verb shama. And now here and in other passages that we'll be dealing with, you want to be aware of the possible meanings of shama beyond just to hear. And the next step in hearing is heeding, to pay attention to and to obey. So shama becomes virtually a word then for the idea of obeying. And so are following, respecting the authority of. And so these pagan nations of Canaan who are being dispossessed, they give heed unto, they are consulting and respecting the message of these soothsayers and diviners. We'ata, negative right up front, see the adversative thing. The nations do that. We'ata, but you now, something else for you. We'ata, as for you, lo Cain, not thus. Nathan Yahweh Elohim. This is not God's will for you. This is not what He has assigned and appointed for you. He has another provision for you. So now he proceeds immediately to state what God's provision is over against all of these others. And let me just pause here before then going on to verse 15 to make a little bit more of a general comment that I might have made right at the beginning of our look at Deuteronomy 18. We're looking at this legislation concerning the Navi as that which has to do with the corporate reality of an office in Israel that would have a whole succession of individuals down through the generations. So there's a whole series. There's the Navi is something which is corporate. Now we don't understand this passage properly and fully if that dimension of it is the only one we see. This is also a messianic prophecy. And in the section of the course I mentioned earlier, where we deal with messianic prophecies in the book of the Pentateuch, we'll deal especially with the ones in the book of Genesis, but we could have added this to the list. We could have dealt with Deuteronomy 18 in that block of material concerning messianic prophecy, because this Navi figure that is dealt with here and confronts us in Deuteronomy 18 is certainly pointing to the Navi of all Navis, the Jesus, the prophet figure. And so we will sort of come back to that aspect of it and present the case for seeing this as a prophecy of the individual antitypical prophet. But meanwhile, our concern is with the typological phenomenon of those prophets who were pointing ahead toward Jesus the Christ, the ultimate prophet. And clearly, I mean, it's easier perhaps to demonstrate the corporate meaning than the individual messianic. I think both are clearly valid. But the corporate one is the most obvious one, is it not? Because it's dealing with the situation then and there in the days of Moses. You're going to confront this general situation there in the land of Canaan, where there are all of these the false prophet phenomenon, and God's Navi is the antidote, the counter provision to meet that contemporary, ongoing, throughout Old Testament times need. And so clearly this Navi is something which is not just the climactic antitypical individual, it's something that was moving along from Moses to Christ as well. And a second thing that we'll encounter in a moment here that again requires the corporate succession of prophets idea is that there is going to emerge, unhappily, the phenomenon of the false prophet within Israel, which we are, of course, familiar with throughout the whole Old Testament. Along with God's true prophets, there were the false prophets, and this passage tackles that question of how to distinguish the one from the other. In fact, back in Deuteronomy 13, that question had already emerged of how to recognize and deal with the false prophet. But my point now is simply this, that the prophet in Deuteronomy 18 is one who must be distinguished from a whole series of false prophets, generation after generation. So clearly the true prophet is also then one which is a succession. All right. Now then, coming to verse 15, again, emphatically, right up front. So don't learn to do this. You don't consult. This is locain, not thus has God appointed for you, rather navi. So verse 15, navi, and right away we begin to get some of the qualifications. Not anyone would meet the prerequisites for this office. One of them was that he must be from the midst of you, from your brethren, to qualify for this office. That was it. Balaam comes along. He has a gift of prophecy. But one thing that shows he's not what Deuteronomy 18 is concerned. He's not from the Israelite covenant community. The Navi must be from the midst of you, from among your brethren. So there's something important. And now, even more significant, more illuminating as to the nature of the prophetic office and the function of the prophetic office is this next statement, kamoni. Here's Moses speaking, and he says, God's going to raise up a Navi, kamoni, like me. So right away, if we had nothing else, we would have the key thought as to what an Old Testament prophet was, that he was a covenant figure, that he was involved in the administration of this covenant that God made originally there through Moses. So Moses is the covenant official, and the other prophets are kamoni, like me. They are not the originators of it. They are not the mediators at this first stage of the game, but they pick up the task. They continue it, starting with Joshua. The whole book of Deuteronomy is leading up to Joshua as the successor of Moses. And when we expect just to give a quick little overview history of the prophetic movement when we're done with the forming and functioning, and where we start there with Joshua. And we normally might not think of Joshua, military leader, et cetera, as a prophet, and yet everything that we will meanwhile have found to belong to the forming of a prophet and to the functioning of it is true in the life of Joshua. He is a prophet figure. And so from Joshua on then, these others are raised up to be successors of Moses as administrators of the covenant. So a prophet from the midst of you, from among your brethren, kamoni, like unto me, Yakim leka Yahweh Eloheka. the Lord your God, now Yakim, from the verb kum, hiphil form, imperfect, Yakim, the Lord will raise up unto you. Now there's another key concept in this whole, when we analyze the qualifications, the formula of the prophet, and one of the first things we are saying, of course, is that he is called, that he is appointed directly by the Lord. Each and every one of the prophets is so set aside and designated by the Lord. By contrast, you think, for example, of the priestly office. And although the original family, the Levites and Aaron as the high priest, is specifically appointed by the Lord, subsequently you have a sort of a dynastic genealogical succession where it is a matter of genealogy rather than of the Lord singling out and calling out by name, as it were, the individual one. But in the case of the prophets, there is that direct calling, designation, setting aside on the part of the Lord as he raises up each and every prophet. And then responsibility rests upon, of course, the covenant community. This being the nature of the Navi, that he's raised up of the Lord himself, and that he is a Moses-like figure, of course, demands that there be respect for his words. And so you shall not give heed, in the same verb, shama, now appears above. Up above, we saw how the Canaanites gave heed, shama, to the various oracular sources that they had. But as for you, you Israelites, you shall give heed unto God's Navi. Then verse 16. This whole arrangement that is spelled out here, this whole provision, turns out to be God's answer to Israel's own request. They had asked for mediatorship in connection with the reception of divine revelation. And to make this point, now Moses takes their minds back to Horeb 40 years earlier, and what had transpired there that brought the Israelites to request something on the order of the prophets. And verse 16 makes the point then. Kikol asher sha'al tameim Yahweh. This is in line with, according to all of that which you requested, Me'im Yahweh Eloheka, from with the Lord your God. Where? At Horeb, back at the Mount of Assembly, back at the covenant-making mountain. In the day of the Kahal. Kahal is the gathering, it is the assembly, and it is particularly the assembly, the covenant-making assembly there at Horeb. This is what you requested back in that situation, saying, this is your particular request, Lo oseh lishmoa et kol Yahweh. Lo, not now. Osef is a tricky little thing. Aleph, Samik, Pei. What's the Aleph? Is the Aleph one of the three radicals of the verb? In which case the verb would be asaf, which means to gather, huh? But no, it's not the first radical of the verb, it's the preformative of the imperfect, huh? It's the first singular imperfect. So that the verb is not asaf with an aleph, it's yasaf with a yod, which means then to add, huh? And so here is the hiphil imperfect, first singular from the verb yasaf. And literally means to add, so that we could just translate it that way. Lo oseh. Here's Israel talking, and Israel says, not would I add lishmoa, to hear, et kol Yahweh Elohai, the kol, the voice of Yahweh, my God. All right, the kol Yahweh. Think back to Genesis 3:8. that's where you hear the Kol Yahweh in that mistranslated passage about Adam and Eve hearing the sound of God's going through the garden. And as I've insisted, it's not some silent little noise, but it's the thunderous sound of the parousia event. When God appears with the trumpets that blast and thunder and lightning, that's the Kol Yahweh. That scares the wits out of Adam and Eve. That scared the wits out of Israel at Sinai. And when they heard it, that was great to hear God speak, but that's enough. And henceforth, a little more distance, please, was their request. So you said at that point, not would I add to hear this kind of thing again. Once here is enough, privileged as we are, but in the future we want some sort of mediating thing. And of course, God's response will be, all right, a Navi will mediate this to you. But it's not just the sound that frightened them, there's also the sight that frightened them. And so the text goes on. They said, not would I add to hear the Kol Yahweh, this thunderous sound of the presence of the glory spirit of my God. And now he speaks of the Aish, the fire, the consuming presence of God's glory, fire on the top of the mountain. And this Aish Hagadolah Hazot, this great fire, not would I see anymore. Why? Lo amut, lest I die. So they knew that the close presence of the Lord, this immediacy of God's holy presence with demonstrations of it in sound and furious fire, constituted an increase in the threat. It constituted an intense threat to their well-being as sinners in the presence of this God, and so it makes sense for them to say, all right, in the future, let's have this mediated. And in fact, the passage goes on to say that God says that they had a good point in asking for mediation, and I will provide it. So I will go on to provide a Navi to mediate for them. Let me see, I'm looking at the clock, and are we supposed to stop at 20 of? Yes. All right, now then, we'll take this from here, and please now review what we've done in class today here in your assigned reading in Deuteronomy 18, and continue beyond that. I expect we will be finishing that.